here. This is a very special evening. I want to give you a warm word of welcome. We have looked forward to this evening for quite some time, I think longer than Andrea and Jessica would wish we had looked forward to it. So we're really glad that you've come to join us for this special celebration. Are you aware that 2/3 of the world's roughly 1.7 billion Mennonites are either African, Asian, or Central American? We always view the East Reserve, maybe uncharitably the West Reserve, as being the meccas of the Mennonite world. Well, we're a relatively small crowd here. There is a very large group of Mennonites around the world, and we are a small number of them. So this evening we're going to focus on a particular group, and that is the Russian Mennonites and their food. We're not going to go to the Swiss Mennonites and see what they eat. My wife grew up in Bluffton, Ohio, and Mennonite food over there includes popcorn. Can you believe that? When they have a celebration like our Pioneer Days, they're cooking popcorn out in the big cauldrons in the yard. It's quite interesting. We won't have any popcorn here this evening. This will be Russian Mennonite food. Every year we establish a theme for what we want to do throughout the year. We've done this for the last 3 or 4 years. And this year the theme we chose was Mennonite food, taste, and transition, which I think is a very interesting theme, partly because I enjoy food quite a bit. There's lots of opportunity to talk about food in our Mennonite culture. But you might be surprised at what all has been discovered in researching Mennonite food. You will find a quote on one of the panels, which was written by, I'm going to surely butcher this name, Franca Iakoveta. If that's close, pretty close, you can correct it. And he writes, I think it's an edible, sorry. She's not here, is she? Edible Histories Toward a Canadian Food History. She writes, food is never just something to eat. Food is a reflection of one's culture and of the social change within one's culture. It tells us who we are, where we have come from, what is important to us. And I hope that you will discover some of those things this evening as you listen to our curators speak and as you spend a little bit of time in the gallery. We're going to have a couple of talks by both Andrea and Jessica, our curators. Andrea will speak first about the various themes in the exhibit. Jessica will come and tell us some stories about artifacts. And then there will be some explanation of the various foods that we're going to offer you this evening. If you find that interesting, then I will come and close the meeting. We'll have our snacks in here before we go to the gallery, because we prefer not to have food in our gallery. And then you will have the opportunity to go to the gallery and explore it, have conversations with Andrea and Jessica and with one another. And that will be our evening. Before we get into that, I'd invite you to bow with me as we pray. Lord God, we've come to celebrate, we've come to learn, to celebrate your faithfulness to our people, to the generations. We've come to learn about their courage, their passion, their zeal in some of the decisions that they made to relocate. And then we've come to learn about some of the things that came with them and some of the things that developed, specifically with regard to food. We ask that you would bless our time together, that we would be present here. We also ask that you would bless the food that we will enjoy later. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Andrea Dick is our senior curator. I'm going to invite her to come and speak. After she has spoken, Jessica McKay, the assistant curator, will come and tell some stories and enjoy.
So like Gary was saying, Mennonite food might seem like an obvious choice for us here at MHB. We do a lot of food-related things. We have a delivery bar and restaurant. We have a functional mill. We do historical demonstrations involving food. But this exhibit didn't come about by any of what we do. It just came about by a casual conversation that we ideas sometimes do between Jessica and I. And the way I remember it, maybe Jessica remembers it a little bit differently. The way I remember it is we had just had coffee, and so we came back into the lab and just started talking about Mennonite food. What does Russian Mennonite food actually mean? Has that changed over time? What do we say it means here at MHB, and how do we present that to the public? And so we were talking about this, and I said, well, I don't know if the food that I ate growing up was what would be considered Mennonite or not. And I said, well, my mom grew up in Germany. Maybe that had something to do with what we ate and how we ate things. My mom is the daughter of immigrants who fled from the Soviet Union in the 40s after the Second World War. And her parents then fled to Paraguay via the Netherlands, went back to Germany in the 50s, and then she came here when she was younger in the 70s. And so I said maybe this impacted what we ate as a family. And then I stopped, and I thought a second. I was a new employee here. I hadn't worked with Jessica very long, and I stopped and I considered my confession that would be coming next, and I decided to just dive in. I said, for example, I don't even know what schnitzel is. It's a biscuit. It's pretty simple for anybody else in the dark here. So after the conversation with Jessica, I learned what schnitzel was. As Barry was saying, Mennonite food taste and transition picks up on several of these key themes that Jessica and I discussed in that conversation. And we came up, in the course of this exhibit, we came up to the conclusion that there can really be no conclusion. What is Russian Mennonite food? There's no clear-cut answer. Even if there was, it would have been in flux throughout history, and it changes still today. As Barry also mentioned, the quote from Franka Yakubeta, food is never just something we eat. We kind of take this for granted, we just grab something to eat today. But it is never something that we just eat. It is a reflection of who we are as a people. So in keeping with her argument that food is a reflection of who we are, where we have come from, and what is important to us, a more appropriate question might be, what can our ideas about Russian Mennonite food tell us about Russian Mennonites, where they came from, what is important to them, and I would add how they have changed over the centuries. This exhibit speaks to these in four separate themes. We look at the traditions and beliefs of Mennonite food and how that impacts the society that it comes from, the impact of food scarcity on this cultural group, migration and food exchange, and defining Mennonite food today. Each of these themes, as I'm talking here as well, raises more questions almost than it answers. So this exhibit and this talk will be comprehensive to the history of Russian Mennonite food. So the first theme that we go through in the exhibit is traditions and beliefs. What can one learn about Russian Mennonites, who they are, and what they believe by exploring the foods they eat? The Mennonite aspiration to exist in the world and not of the world was expressed in the way family and civic life was organized in the traditional Mennonite communities that were established in southern Manitoba in 1874. Community life necessitated cooperation from all families and from all individuals within those families in order to succeed. The foods Mennonites ate and their practices surrounding food production, preparation, and consumption were an outward expression of this belief, articulated in daily living. Although household duties were divided along gender lines, with men taking charge of the farm and the farming operations, and women taking charge of the home, the vegetable garden, and the orchard, and all the food production that goes into caring for a family. Each member helped to contribute to the success of the household. In the same way that each family member contributed, the cooperation of each family was necessary for this community structure. In the area of food and food production, the efforts of the entire community were needed in order to succeed. Activities like hog butchering, which is in this great photo up there, that is, we don't know the date on that photo, but it's from Russia. So activities like hog butchering, seeding, and harvesting crops, all vital to an individual's family for survival and from year to year, were impossible undertakings without the assistance of neighbors. And there you see several families gather together. There's usually about 5 to 6 families gather together to slaughter hogs in the harvest season. In the Russian Mennonite context, community was, in a very real sense, vital to food. Food, however, was also vital to community, and its consumption played an important role in building and then reinforcing these important community ties. An excellent example of this is the photo behind me, in the ubiquitous Sunday afternoon visiting. Mennonite women automatically prepared food over and above the needs of her family, anticipating the guests that would join them at their table that afternoon. Fasfa, the light meal of things like zwieback, jam, cheese, whole wheat, coffee, and various desserts was, and maybe still is in some Mennonite homes today, a staple for these occasions and many others. The impacts of food scarcity. Mennonites in Russia experienced both the extremes of abundance before World War I and war, famine, terror after the 1917 Communist Revolution in the Soviet Union. In times of prosperity, Mennonite culture thrived, and Mennonites developed a rich food tradition that was informed by their beliefs and the world around them. But what is the role that food played in times of scarcity, and what have been the impacts of those periods in history on Mennonite culture? For those living through war, displacement, and loss, activities as basic as cooking and eating brought relief and cultural affirmation in a chaotic time. The disintegration of what is now called the Golden Age of Mennonite life in Russia began with World War I, from 1914 to 1918, which was followed successively by incomprehensible events. The Communist Revolution in 1917, which was followed by the Russian Civil War, decades of terror in the 1920s and 30s, World War II from 1939 to 1945, and then fleeing as refugees in the post-war years. This period of turmoil was characterized by anarchist raids, massacres, civil war, malnutrition, diseases like typhus, smallpox, pneumonia, and diphtheria, and waves of arrests, deportations, and executions. Hunger during these periods drove people to eat anything that had even a minuscule amount of nutrition. Gruel, acacia flowers, tree bark, mushrooms, sawdust, corn stalks, thistles, dried weeds, gophers, dogs, cats, mice, and granary sweepings. Hunger and desperation also compelled many Mennonites to compromise their consciences. Smuggling or stealing food became common. For many refugees, falsifying information, bribing border officials, and stealing food from farmers' fields were necessary if regrettable actions taken for survival. When Mennonites finally crossed the border from the Soviet Union, the milk, cheese, sausage, and white bread with butter that they were served are often cited as their first memories in the Netherlands. To the Mennonites, these refugee camps in Europe offered a rescue from starvation, and the prospect of immigrating to Canada represented the epitome of abundance. What impacts have these times of food scarcity and hunger had on the individuals who lived through these experiences and on their descendants? Scholars have identified the concept of food trauma as being the enduring physical and psychological injury resulting from food deprivation. This trauma is lived by the individuals who experienced hunger themselves, but often also felt by the next generation who are shaped by their parents' attitude toward food. Mennonite refugees arriving in Canada from World War II came with a history of food deprivation that shaped their beliefs about food and eating for decades, and often for a lifetime. Things like hoarding, overeating, and overfeeding, excessively decadent meals, and perpetual discussion of food reflected continued anxiety over food supply and security. Food was never taken for granted, never to be wasted. Once again, exploring the topic of food, people's ideas about it, and what it symbolized for Mennonite identity gets to the heart of experience of both abundance and scarcity in Russian Mennonite history. Migration and food exchange. The first reaction when you the quintessential list that might include borscht, Reneke, mos, watermelon, and Walkuchen, Pascha, and so forth. Ironically, these foods are all borrowed from other cultures, around which the Mennonites settled throughout Europe and later throughout North and South America. Looking at Russian Mennonite history through the lens of food highlights the often dynamic relationship that Mennonites had with the cultures around them despite their desire to live in isolation from the non-Mennonite world. Horselkjø. These are round, raisin-filled fritters, deep fried, rolled in sugar, and eaten on New Year's Eve, which sounds delightful at this point in the evening. For example, they have their roots in the Dutch version called oliebol in a picture, which is there. I can't tell the difference between what the Mennonite and the Dutch version look like. Moos, a cold fruit soup, which doesn't sound super attractive, but it's very good. It stems from 16th century Russia. Zwieback, perhaps one of the most well-known Russian Mennonite foods, has its origin in either the Netherlands or Prussia. Russia and Ukraine have had, of course, a tremendous influence on the Russian Mennonite diet. Many dishes were first borrowed from other cultures and then adapted to fit Mennonite tastes. An example of this is the Ukrainian Pascha, a ceremonial Easter bread, which is baked by Ukrainians in tall, round loaves with intricate religious symbols baked into the dough. Mennonite Pascha looks nothing like that, although it is borrowed from that original. It's usually baked in the horizontal form of a typical loaf of bread and covered in sweet icing. Our picture here is from Mennonite Girls Can Cook, so that does not look like a traditional Mennonite Pascha, but it's a new take on that. Vanika or pierogies, too, were adapted from Ukrainian versions. To Ukrainians, pierogies are filled with cheese and potatoes and fried, while Mennonites eat them boiled, filled with cottage cheese and covered in a white cream gravy called schmolfat. This tradition of borrowing and adapting foods from non-Mennonites continues today. Russian-descended Mennonites in Paraguay enjoy the tradition of yerba mate and have brought this drink north to Canada with them in return migrations. Corn and beans, staples in the Mexican diet, were adopted as principal crops by the Canadian Mennonites arriving in Mexico from Canada in the 1920s and added to the Mennonite diet with other Mexican foods like tomatillos and chilies, which were added to otherwise traditional Mennonite soups. We see a photographic exploration of this Mexican influence on Mennonite cooking in one of the displays on this side of the auditorium in the exhibit by the Steinbach Regional Secondary School photography class. We also see examples of Mennonite foods infiltrating the non-Mennonite world in mass-produced products like store-bought farmer sausage, which is available in many mainstream grocery stores, at least in Manitoba. And in what's behind me, queso Mennonita, which is literally Mennonite cheese, a type of cheddar cheese that was first produced by Mennonites in Chihuahua, Mexico, so these are Canadian-descended Mennonites, in the 20s and 30s, and now available and widely recognized throughout Mexico. So this leads us to the question of how do we define Mennonite food today? If the question, what is Russian Mennonite food, is difficult to answer from a historical perspective, it's nearly impossible to define from our perspective today. Urbanization, global missions, and international migrations, both Mennonite and non-Mennonite, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries and continuing today, have changed the ethnic and cultural makeup of Mennonite congregations and conferences around the world. Mennonite churches in North America have changed through the introduction of immigrants and refugees, many sponsored by Mennonite churches in the 20th century. From 1979 to 1980, for example, approximately 4,000 Southeast Asians arrived in Manitoba, a large portion of whom were sponsored by Mennonite churches. Mennonites worked with these newcomers to build congregations reflecting their diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds, and today there are 8 Mennonite churches and affiliated congregations in Manitoba oriented toward Mennonites of non-European descent. Examples of this would be the Vietnamese Mennonite Church or the Chinese Mennonite Brethren Church, both in Mennonite. On a global scale, Mennonite membership shows that there are now more Mennonites in Africa and Asia than there are in Europe and North and South America combined. By country, the United States still has the highest Mennonite population according to the Mennonite World Conference's statistics for 2014. Notably, Canada is ranked 5th in the list, behind Ethiopia, India, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. These statistics once again call our assumptions about Mennonite food into question. It has been said that the act of eating is an endlessly evolving enactment of gender, family, and community relationships. Looking at the case of Russian Mennonites, we would add that it is also interwoven with religious beliefs, ethnic traditions, socioeconomic realities, local landscapes and environments, neighboring cultures, world politics, and international migrations. All of these influences have resulted in a diverse food tradition with a rich history. Today, nearly 5 centuries after the birth of Anabaptism, defining Mennonite food continues to be a dynamic and unfolding story. Jessica will come and tell us about a few of the artifacts that we included in the exhibit.
So I'm just going to talk about specifically a couple of artifacts that you'll see in the exhibit, focusing on the period in Canada, 1893 until 1915, and the impact that women specifically had on Mennonite food. So Mennonite food has adapted to new environments and been influenced by the neighbors, just as Andrew was talking about, but nowhere as rapidly and drastically as in North America. Following the migration from South Russia to Canada in 1874, Mennonite newcomers sought to transplant their way of life to the Canadian landscape. Inevitably, Mennonites met and interacted with their neighbors. New technologies, urbanization, and neighbors from vastly different cultural backgrounds all influenced Mennonite foodways, and Mennonite women were the ones at the forefront of this exchange. Particularly, Mennonite midwives, domestic servants, and women chefs show this food exchange and the significant impact of these women on Mennonite foodways in Canada. So yeah, this first artifact is the Anatoli's Remedy Book. It illustrates the Mennonite midwives, how they at one time both were crucial to the separatist communities and helping the cohesion of those communities, while simultaneously venturing outside of them to Francophone communities, Métis, Aboriginal, and sharing food knowledge and medicinal knowledge. Anna Dews is one such Mennonite midwife from the Blue North area. She was active between 1893 and 1932, and throughout her career she caught, as I like to say, more than 1,000 babies, ranging over 2 generations. In addition to Blue North, she lent her services to the Métis people of St. Anne and Richard, and in her journal she documented recipes and remedies for the curing of the ailments of the people she treated. So you'll find recipes for women. And so the Meichin-Han were groups of domestic servants in Winnipeg. There were 2 Meichin-Han homes, and they served as kind of a base of operations for them to meet weekly for meals and fellowship. In the 1920s and 30s, these were necessitated by the young Mennonite women who moved from rural Manitoba to Winnipeg. They were the vanguard of the Mennonite move from rural farms to towns and to big cities. As domestic servants, they learned Scottish recipes, how to cook kosher meals, anything that their hosts would be asking for dinner. Certainly bringing home these influences and ideas as well. So this classroom bowl is an example of something that a domestic servant brought home from the city. It belonged to Katie Jansen Morkentine. She made the move to Winnipeg to contribute to her family's income. The family had emigrated from the Crimea in the Soviet Union and arrived in Altoona in 1924. Katie was employed as a domestic in Winnipeg from 1926 until her marriage in 1930. So this fruit bowl was a gift given to Katie by the mistress of the household in which she worked. This was really, really common with 1920s and 1940s migration that Andrew was talking about. They came from Russia, and this was the best way to supplement the income and get the farm started in Manitoba. So meanwhile, there were Mennonites going to the cities, and also Mennonite communities were experiencing internal urbanization. One didn't have to travel to Winnipeg to eat modern foods since they were served on Main Street by women chefs like Helena F. Brandt and Helena Nicole Peters. The Brandt Cafe, we've got a couple artifacts including a banana split dish, fully gas, spoon, menu. Helena Friesen Brandt was the head cook there from 1935 to 1945. The Brandt family owned and operated a restaurant, the Brandt's Cafe. It was located on the same property as the A.S. Friesen Machine Works and where the windmill was, that major property on Main Street. The restaurant served delicious home-cooked meals and baking. Traveling salesmen would call out their favorite pie order to whichever Brandt family member would be near the front door as they drove by. It would be ready for them upon their return a little while later. Incidentally, 1936 was one of the hottest summers on record, and the restaurant ran full tilt without air conditioning and dishwashers. The restaurant was closed in 1945 due to Helena's deteriorating health, and she passed away a year later. So the restaurant really hinged on her. She was the force behind it. Similarly, the tourist hotel restaurant was opened in 1916 by the Peter B. Peters family. His wife, Helena Rebel Peters, was the cook. After Peter passed away just a few years later, Helena and her family took over the business. She worked there until her death in 1958. Both the Brandt Cafe and Tourist Hotel were part of an ongoing internal urbanization of Steinbach and reflected what was happening in Mennonite towns and villages across Manitoba. Canadian foods are making their way to Mennonite communities. And you can tell on the menu, there's no protein, it's all that kind of diner food. So yeah. That's my skill.